So, in previous episodes, I have looked at German tanks and tank destroyers of the World War II period that need adding to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at German self-propelled guns, artillery vehicles, and assault guns. These being the vehicles that were generally armed with howitzer or large caliber artillery weapons, and usually relied on large caliber shells and HE shells to destroy their targets. Also, like with the German tank destroyers video, we will be looking at these vehicles based on the chassis they utilised, starting with the Panzer I, or more specifically the 15cm SIG 33 SF Alf Panzerkampfwagen 1 Ausf B, more commonly known as the Bison. Basically, by 1940 the Panzer I was out of production, and in any case was only armed with machine guns, making it rather obsolete for the modern battlefield, but the chassis was still useful for conversion to other roles. This was good for the Germans, as the initial campaign in Poland had highlighted a need for a self-propelled gun that was able to keep up with advancing troops, as up to this point German artillery was usually reliant on horses, and sometimes half-tracks or similar vehicles. To this end, it was decided to convert various Panzer Is by removing the turret and superstructure, and mounting a 150mm SIG 33 artillery weapon atop of it, wheels and all, as you can see in these images, though most of the production vehicles also had this rather large and ungainly superstructure added for protection. Now, the SIG 33 is capable of firing HE and heat shells in-game, with the former having a penetration of 61mm and a muzzle velocity of 240 meters a second, while the latter has a penetration of 185mm and an improved muzzle velocity of 280 meters a second. So we have a good variety of deadly shells here, though some other shells could also be carried, including the Stielgranate 42, which was fitted over the barrel and had a maximum range of 1000 meters, but had an explosive filling of 54 kilograms, compared to 38 kilograms for the in-game HE shell. So this could be a useful shell to have in-game, balanced by the fact it would take longer to reload, due to needing to be fitted over the barrel. Meanwhile, the reload speed in-game is 14.4 seconds, and it has a horizontal traverse of 12.5 degrees either direction and an elevation of -4 to +75 degrees. So this has better firing arcs than its successor, the 33B SFL, and makes it useful for aiming at close-in targets and as an impromptu artillery vehicle in-game. Unfortunately, the armour is very thin, with the armour maxing out at just 13mm for the hull and superstructure, which doesn't cover the rear and is open-topped, making the forecrew easy pickings for enemy aircraft, while its top speed is 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour from a 100 horsepower Maybach NL36TR engine. In-game, this could work at 1.0, maybe before its successor, the 15cm SIG 33B SFL, giving us a rather unusual looking vehicle that still packs a punch and would make for a good artillery vehicle in Tier 1, and we could get two variants if needed, one with the armoured shields and one without, which would allow us to have two vehicles, or at least an optional modification on one. In real life, 38 Panzer Is would be converted in February 1940, and these were used in the invasion of France, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and although superseded by more effective designs, some were still serving in mid-1943 on the Eastern Front, which is a pretty good service life for an early attempt at creating a self-propelled artillery vehicle. So only one artillery vehicle would be based on the Panzer I, and this wasn't built in large numbers. But as the war continued, it was increasingly clear that there was still a need for self-propelled artillery vehicles, so efforts would shift to adapting the Panzer II to such a role. Initially, this would be in the form of another SIG 33 armed vehicle, which is already in-game as the 15cm SIG 33B SFL, and it is the starting SPG on the German tech tree, but only 12 of these would be built, with these used in North Africa where they were all destroyed or captured, though at least 3 remained to be taken over by the Egyptians for use against the Israelis during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. However, from 1942 a more famous self-propelled howitzer vehicle based on the Panzer II would be produced, the SD KFZ-124, or Vespa, which is Wasp in English. Though this wasn't its official name, with a variety of official designations being used over the years. The Vespa would be designed by Alket in early 1942 and was based on the Panzer II-F, with the engine moved to the centre and the fighting compartment based at the rear of the vehicle. The main armament of the Vespa would be the 105mm LEFH 18M length 28 howitzer, which has a horizontal traverse of 17 degrees right and left, and an elevation of -5 to +42 degrees. Now this weapon is capable of firing a variety of different shells with different charges, with these charges given a muzzle velocity of 200 to 460 meters a second, depending on the shell and charge used, though we will assume that the largest charges possible for each shell will be used in-game. As for the shells themselves, we have a HE shell weighing 14.8 kilograms with 1.38 kilograms of explosive, giving around 15 to 25 millimeters of penetration, two standard anti-tank shells, one weighing 14.2 kilograms with 650 grams of explosives and a muzzle velocity of 395 meters a second, and a later one weighing 15.7 kilograms, having 400 grams of explosive and a muzzle velocity of 390 meters a second, with this shell having an armor penetration of 67 millimeters at 500 meters, which isn't too bad. There was also a discarding sabot shell developed for later 105mm guns, the Panzergranate 39TS, but this could still be fired from the 18M, with this having a much greater muzzle velocity of 765 meters a second and a penetration of 91mm at 500 meters, making this an excellent anti-tank shell. However, the best anti-tank shells will be the heat shells, with Ian Hogg's German artillery of World War II giving a penetration of 100mm at a 0-degree angle, or 70mm at a 30-degree angle, which is pretty good, though identically named shells in-game penetrate up to 115mm, so it is possibly even more powerful than stated. And smoke shells and explosive/incendiary shells could also be carried, while an MG34 is carried for use against soft-skinned vehicles and enemy aircraft. Armour was understandably light, maxing out at 30mm for the hull and 20mm for the superstructure, which is again open-topped, making the 5 crew extremely vulnerable to enemy tanks and aircraft. Lastly, the top speed was 25 mph or 40 km/h from a 140 horsepower Maybach HL62TR engine, which is again decent enough for this vehicle. In War Thunder, I could maybe see the Vesper being added at 2.7 between the Marder 3 and Marder 3H, with the HE shell not being the greatest, but its AP shells allowing it to do a decent job against enemy tanks, while the Sabot and heat shells will allow it to deal with all but the most heavily armoured tanks, and it would just be nice for this rather major vehicle to be added in War Thunder. However, the non-inclusion of this vehicle in War Thunder is rather baffling, as like I say, it was built in large numbers, and it would give Germany access to a decent if not spectacular artillery vehicle, and would be far more preferable to the M55 that has been added as a copy-paste vehicle to the German tech tree, so hopefully we will see this vehicle added in the future. In real life, 676 Vespers would be built from February 1943 to July 1944, along with 159 munition carriers, and these fought until the end of the war, with a number of these surviving in various museums. Moving on from the Panzer II, we then have the Czechoslovakian Panzer 35T and 38T. Now the Panzer 35T didn't have any large guns or howitzers mounted, which makes sense as it was no longer in production when Germany took over Czechoslovakia, but was still a useful combat tank, and by the time it started to become obsolete there would have been very few left, so there was never any efforts to rearm them. However, it was a different story with the Panzer 38T, which was kept in production, and while it too became obsolete as a combat tank by the end of 1941, its chassis was still very useful for a variety of different roles, including as an SPG or SPH vehicle. So we'll start with the SDKFZ 138/1 or Grill, which came about in 1942, with Alket beginning work on developing a prototype, with BMM later joining the project, and a prototype was ready by April 1942, though production wouldn't start until February 1943, almost a year later. The initial production variant of the Griller would be built on the Panzer 38T-H chassis with a rear-mounted engine, and this was again armed with the 150mm SIG 33, having a traverse of 5 degrees both ways horizontally and an elevation of -3 to +72. However, it still has an effective HE shell, capable of penetrating 61mm, and a heat shell capable of penetrating 185mm in-game, as well as a smoke shell and the Stihlgranate 42 that was mounted over the barrel, while an MG34 was also carried. Armour was again light, with the superstructure being open-topped and maxing out at 25mm, though the whole front is 50mm, which will give a bit of protection against smaller caliber weapons. Lastly, the crew carried was 5, and it could reach a top speed of 21.7 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour on a 140 horsepower Praga EPA/2 engine. I could see this working in game at 1.0, maybe folded with the in-game SIG-33B SFL, as this variant of the Grilla is rather similar to that vehicle with regards to stats and main armament, so this would give some more options in the early tiers. In real life, 200 Guerrillas would be ordered, with 90 Guerrillas and one prototype produced on the Ausf H chassis from February to April 1943, before production switched to the K chassis. This was very similar to those built on the H chassis, with the same 150mm gun and MG34 machine gun, but had an extra degree of elevation, and the armour now maxed out at just 20mm, and the weight increased from 11.5 tons to 12 tons. This could also be added, maybe on the tech tree or as a premium vehicle, or vice versa, with the variant built on the H chassis, giving us a regular version and premium version for the lower tiers. In real life, 110 grills would be built on the K chassis from April to June 1943, but a second production order would be made for October 1943 to September 1944, bringing the total built to 282, with these serving until the end of the war, with 173 still available for service in February 1945. Interestingly, 10 would also be built on a chassis intended for the Flak Panzer 38, which could also be added, maybe as a premium vehicle. So the Panzer 38T chassis was used for SPGs, but nowhere near to the extent it was used for tank destroyers. However, the Jagdpanzer 38 tank destroyer, which was derived from Panzer 38T components, would also be used as a basis for an SPG, in the form of the 15cm SIG-33/2 SFL Alf Jagdpanzer 38T, or Garat 588. Now, the chassis was actually built on the chassis of the Bergerpanzer 38T, which was an armoured recovery vehicle that was based on the Jagdpanzer 38, and this was again armed with the 150mm SIG-33, with a horizontal traverse of 5 degrees left and right, and an elevation of 0 to plus 73, while an MG34 or MG42 was carried for close-in defence. Armour was pretty decent, maxing out at 60mm for the hull and superstructure, though it is open-topped, leaving the 4 crew vulnerable to enemy aircraft, and the top speed is 20 miles per hour or 32 kilometers an hour from a 160 horsepower Praga AC2 engine. This could probably work at 2.7 between the Marder 3 and Marder 3H, giving us a rather unique variant of the Jagdpanzer 38, with a good main armament and improved armour, allowing it to be used in a more direct fashion against enemy tanks, and it would be nice to see this vehicle in-game. In real life, we know that at least the prototype was built, and purportedly 30 would be produced in December 1944, 24 from scratch and 6 converted from Jagdpanzer 38s. Though images only exist of the prototype, and there seems to be precious little evidence of the existence of more of these vehicles, whether in use, knocked out after combat, or captured by the Allies or Soviets. So it's possible that 30 might have been ordered and maybe even started production, but were never finished or perhaps were converted to regular Jagdpanzer 38s for whatever reason. After this, we then have a few vehicles that I probably could have covered in the German Tank Destroyer episode, but luckily I didn't, as it turns out there are 2 very similar vehicles here. So the first of these is the Aufklärungspanzer 38T mit 7.5cm KWK 37, length 24, which is basically a prototype of the SDKFZ 141 that we already have in game, but armed with a KWK 37 length 24 75mm gun from the early Panzer IV, and with a new superstructure with extended sides. The KWK 37 would mainly rely on its heat shell, having an in-game penetration of 80mm, while its HE shell penetrates 10mm and its APC-BC shell 45mm at 500 metres, while a smoke shell is also carried, though it is let down by the lack of a turret, limiting its effectiveness against fast-moving vehicles and allowing it to be flanked more easily. Meanwhile, the armour should max out at 50mm, though it is unfortunately open-topped, while a crew of 4 is carried, and it has a top speed of 36 miles per hour or 58 kilometers an hour, much like the 20mm armed vehicle. This could work at 2.0 to 2.3, maybe as a premium counterpart to the in-game Aufklärungspanzer 38T, and I could see this being a rather popular vehicle in the lower tiers. In real life, 2 prototypes were built in 1944, presumably to the same design, but there might have been some differences, though it doesn't appear to have gone into production. Then there is a very similar vehicle based on the Berger Panzer 38 armoured recovery vehicle, sometimes called the Garat 564, and seems to get confused with the previous vehicle, and this was also armed with the KWK Length 24 75mm gun, but with improved armour that is sloped to 60mm, though it is again open-topped, and it should have a top speed of 26 miles per hour or 42 kilometers an hour from a 160 horsepower AC2 engine, while presumably a crew of 4 was carried, and again this could work at 2.3 to 2.7, being similar to the previous vehicles but with more armour, and it is also a bit slower, but it would still be an interesting vehicle to have in game. In real life it seems like only one was built in 1944, and may have been used to test a Tatra diesel engine, but ultimately didn't go into production. Then lastly, for the Jagd Panzer 38 based vehicles, we have what in the Encyclopedia of German Tanks of World War II Revised Edition is called the Mittlere Einheitswaffenträger, or Medium Standardized Weapons Carrier, also known as the Krupp 1, but it also kind of looks like it's referring to the Leichter design, which was much like the Waffenträger we have in game. Either way, this was designed to be armed with a variety of different weapons, but in the one prototype we have 2 pictures of, it was fitted with the 105mm LEFH 1840/5 length 28 howitzer, which the same book says has a fully rotating turret and elevation of -5 to +42, but most other sources seem to indicate that it was not fully rotating, which would limit its effectiveness. Armour is naturally light, with the armour maxing out at 20mm but generally being 10 to 15mm in most areas, with the turret being open-topped, while the top speed was to be 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 4 was carried. This would make for a good artillery counterpart to the 88mm armed Waffenträger, but of course less effective. But it could still work at 2.7 to 3.0, and would be an interesting vehicle to have in game. In real life it seems like only the one prototype vehicle was made and fitted with the 105mm gun, and this was captured by British troops at the end of the war. But unfortunately we only have the 2 photos of it, and it was likely scrapped after the war. So moving on from the light tanks, we now come to the self-propelled guns and howitzers based on German medium tanks, starting with the Panzer III. Surprisingly, we don't have a huge amount of SPGs here to look at, not counting the Stug 3, which we looked at in the Tank Destroyers episode, but we do have a few designs here. The first of these was an impromptu conversion where in 1942 a damaged Panzer IIIH in North Africa was fitted with the 150mm SIG-33 with an armoured shield in place of the turret and superstructure. This should have a maximum armour thickness for the hull of 60mm from 2 30mm plates, with the gun shield being lightly armoured and the fighting compartment being open-topped, while the top speed was 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour and 4 to 5 crew would be carried. This could probably be added at 2.0, having an effective albeit short-ranged armament, which I also haven't found a traverse for, so it's possible that's going to be quite limited, but it does also have a decent amount of hull armour, and it would be interesting to see the Panzer III used in the SPG role. In real life only the one Panzer IIIH was converted, probably on an ad hoc basis. Basically the Germans had a spare gun lying around and a damaged Panzer IIIH in close proximity of each other, and a workshop available, so it just made sense to combine the 2 together, and presumably the need for such a conversion lessened, or the right circumstances didn't come up again for future conversions to be carried out. However, there would be a more dedicated assault gun in the Sturminfanteriegeschütz 33B. Now this seems to have a bit of disputed history in some of my books, with the Encyclopedia of German Tanks of World War II saying that they were ordered in 1941. But it seems to be a bit of an outlier, and the basic premise seems to have been that with the Germans battling to take the Soviet city of Stalingrad in 1942, there was a need for assault vehicles with heavy guns to attack heavily entrenched Soviet forces. Thus, in a 22nd of September 1942 conference, a requirement for the new vehicle was set out, with it to be armed with a 150mm SIG-33, and it was to be heavily armoured, with 12 vehicles to be produced. Now, interestingly, this was to be built on various converted Stug 3 chassis, from the Stug 3A to the Stug 3F, with the Stug, of course, originally being based on the Panzer III. The armament, as mentioned, was the 150mm SIG 33/1, which was now designed specifically for fitting to armoured vehicles, with the wheels and trail now removed unlike on the Bison, but it still fires HE and heat shells at a muzzle velocity of 240 to 280 meters a second, and with a rather limited traverse, being just 3 degrees right and left and with an elevation of -3 to +25 degrees, showing that this really was intended for short-range engagements, while an MG34 was fitted to the right side of the vehicle for close-in defence. Luckily for us, unlike some of the previous vehicles, the 33B is well armoured, with a maximum of 80mm of armour for the front, 50 to 30mm for the sides, and 30 to 15mm for the rear, making this well protected frontally, though with mostly flat-sided armour. The mobility, on the other hand, is in a rather odd position. You see, it is still the same Maybach HL120TRM as used on the previous Stug 3s, but the top speed is now reduced from 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour to just 12.4 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour. Now, obviously, this is a drastic reduction in speed, and I assumed that this was due to weight increases. After all, the bigger gun and extra armour have to have had some effect on the weight. However, all of my sources state that the weight was actually decreased, from 21.6 tonnes of the Stug 3F to 21 tonnes for the 33B. This seems to be a rather odd situation, and I can only assume that either the figures are taken from a 33B that was in some way defective, giving worse results, or maybe some other changes were made that weren't documented, like a new engine or transmission, or perhaps the details were just recorded wrong. But it's definitely one of the odder discrepancies I've seen when researching for this series. Lastly, the Crewwood number 5, which is about standard for this type of vehicle. In-game, I could see this being added at 3.3 to 4.0, depending on its effectiveness, as the 33B has a very effective, albeit short-ranged gun, with a decent amount of armour, only let down by its slow top speed, and as I said at the beginning, it was converted from various Stug variants, meaning we could in theory get multiple versions of this vehicle added, and it would definitely be a unique vehicle for the lower tiers of the German tech tree. In real life, as mentioned, there are some discrepancies on the history of this vehicle, but the general history seems to be that after being ordered on the 22nd of September, the first 6 vehicles were ready by 7th of October, with a further 6 ready by the 10th, and a further 12 finished by the end of October, making this a very fast turnaround from ordering to completion. The first 12 would be sent to Stalingrad, arriving by early November, but just a few weeks later, on the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets would launch Operation Uranus, encircling the Germans in Stalingrad, with the 33Bs in the area being lost as a result. The remaining 12 would be used in the failed attempts to break the encirclement, and despite being useful at reducing fortifications, they seem to have been subsequently lost over time, though surprisingly one does still survive at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. So now we move on to the Panzer IV, and here we get a whole bunch of self-propelled guns and howitzers, including an SPG that I've been waiting to be added to the game for a very long time. I am of course talking about the Hummel, or Bumblebee in English, which isn't its technical name but is the name I will be using for it. Now, the Hummel came about from a decision on the 25th of July 1942 to mount the 150mm SFH-18 artillery gun onto the Panzer III or IV chassis, with the Panzer II taking the smaller 105mm LEFH. Now, the chassis used was actually the Geschützwagen 3/4, which is already in-game for the Nashorn tank destroyer, and indeed the Hummel is basically a carbon copy of that vehicle, but the chassis used various components like the front drive wheels and transmission from the Panzer III-J, and the engine and suspension from the Panzer IV, with the whole being that of a Panzer IV but lengthened. Now, the SFH-18, like with the 105mm gun on the Vespa, uses various charges to propel its shells, with the standard 1-6 charge propelling them to around 210 to 375 meters a second. However, there were more powerful charges that could take this up to 495 meters a second, but were only used rarely in very special cases, as these would cause stress on the gun barrel. But of course, War Thunder kind of assumes everything works 100% of the time, so we could probably have this maximum charge as standard, making this gun far more useful for long-range engagements than the SIG-33 armed vehicles. Meanwhile, its horizontal traverse was 15 degrees right and left, and its elevation -3 to +42, giving it good flexibility for engaging close and far-off targets. As for the ammunition fired, it can fire at least 2 HE shells, the GR19 weighing 43.5 kilograms, and the GR36 FES weighing 36.50 kilograms. And I suspect these will penetrate around 60 to 70 millimeters of armour. Then there is the GR39 HLA heat shell as used on SIG-33, which can also be used, giving a penetration of 185 millimeters, which will allow it to deal with all but the most heavily armoured enemies. There were also 2 anti-concrete shells, with the GR19BE ROT weighing 43.45 kilograms and having 3.25 kilograms of TNT, and using Gaijin's damage calculator, and assuming it is fired at the maximum muzzle velocity, this gives us an armour penetration of around 95 to 100 millimeters at point blank range, which is not a bad performance at all. So these shells would make the Hummel a pretty deadly vehicle, but there were a number of more experimental shells that could perhaps be added in-game, including a number of Sabo shells, such as the 15cm SPRGR 42TS, which had a 127mm subcaliber HE shell with 4.05 kilograms of explosives, which should have worse penetration but a higher muzzle velocity, while the Panzergranate 39TS fired an 88mm subcaliber shell, which I believe is represented in-game on the mouse, which fires it from a 128mm gun, and this would give us a shell with a muzzle velocity of 880 meters a second, with 64 grams of explosive mass, or 109 grams of TNT equivalent, and could supposedly penetrate 172mm at 500 meters at a 0-degree angle, or 140mm at a 30-degree angle, again making this a very useful shell and turning the Hummel into a true tank destroyer. There was also a rocket-propelled shell, which used more propellant than even the heaviest regular charge, giving us a shell that in real life could reach up to 19,000 meters, or more practically for us would have a higher muzzle velocity, but could only be fired from guns with muzzle brakes, which only seems to have been fitted to the prototype. Meanwhile, on the War Thunder forum, Ghost Maxi has posted information about a Heat FS shell, the GR39HL/A MIT Minenleitwerk, which weighed 45 kilograms, had a muzzle velocity of 370 meters a second, and could penetrate 245 millimeters of armor at a 30-degree angle. Again, giving us a great shell for against heavily armored enemies, though would be a little tricky to use at longer ranges. Lastly, a smoke shell can also be carried, allowing you to give yourself and allies some concealment at short notice. And of course an MG34 was carried for close-in and anti-air defence. Moving on, the Hummel also came in 2, technically 3 variants, with a prototype, early production model and later production model. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Nashorn is basically the same vehicle and is based off the early production model with a raised driver's position, while the prototype was the same but with a muzzle brake for the gun. The late production model, however, had the entire frontal area of the vehicle raised, giving more room for the radio operator, who is labelled a machine gunner in-game. As for the rest of the stats, the armour should be the same as the in-game Nashorn, maxing out at 30mm for the hull and 10mm for the open-topped superstructure, while the top speed is 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 6 is carried. In-game we could probably get all 3 variants, with the prototype being an event or premium vehicle, while the early and late production models could be added to the tech tree at around 4.7, with the late version maybe having access to more shells than the early one. Overall, this would be more useful than the M44 and M55 due to its larger variety of shells, while of course being an iconic German vehicle and due to sharing the Nashorn chassis, and I believe being added in-game at one point as a vehicle that can be targeted in air battles, should make this relatively easy to add, and so I would love to see this long overdue vehicle in War Thunder. In real life, the prototype would be ready by October 1942, and 705 Hummels would be built from February 1943 until the end of the war, with the Hummel first seeing combat at the Battle of Kursk and serving on various fronts until the end of the war, with 6 vehicles still surviving to this day. So the Hummel would go on to be a very useful SPG for the Germans, but in December 1944 it was planned for the Hummel to be fitted with the lighter 105mm LE-FH as found on the Vespa, with the new vehicle becoming the Hummel-Vespa, of which only one photo exists. This might seem an odd choice, as the Hummel was better suited to carrying the larger 150mm gun, but the lighter Vespa had gone out of production in June 1944, when the advancing Soviets had captured the factory producing them in Warsaw, Poland. So with the Germans still needing a vehicle armed with the 105mm weapon, it made logical sense to fit it to the Hummel. The stats for this vehicle should remain the same, with the only difference being the change in main armament, with the 105mm howitzer firing smaller shells at lower muzzle velocities, so its HE shells penetrates 15 to 25mm of armour, its best anti-tank shell 67mm at 500 metres, its Panzergranate 39TS Sabo shell 91mm at 500 metres, and its heat shell up to 115mm at a 0 degree angle, or 100mm depending on other sources, while smoke and explosive/incendiary shells could also be used. This could work at maybe around 2.7 to 3.0, giving players a chance to get used to the Hummel before getting the main version, as well as giving us a rather unusual vehicle for the lower tiers, and this could be an interesting counterpart to the Vespa. In real life, despite the chassis already being in production, only 11 or so Hummel Vespas were reported to be built, and these don't seem to have seen any service. However, this wasn't the first time a 105mm gun had been fitted to the Panzer IV, or at least chassis that were based on or were similar to it, as there was a previous design in the form of the Geschützwagen 4B, or SDKFZ 165-1, which came about from a 1939 proposal from Krupp, which would result in a wooden mock-up and orders for prototype vehicles in November 1940. So the 4B, as I will call it, is armed with the 105mm LEFH 18/1, which as mentioned can fire a wide variety of shells, and unlike previous vehicles we've looked at, it is placed in a turret. Unfortunately, this turret only turns 35 degrees each way horizontally, which is better than the previous vehicles but nowhere near as good as a fully rotating turret, while the elevation is -10 to +40. Armour is also relatively light, maxing out at just 30mm for the front and 14.5mm for the sides and rear, while the turret is open-topped, making the 4B extremely vulnerable to enemy fire, while its top speed is 28 mph or 45 km/h from a 180 horsepower Maybach HL66P engine, which isn't too bad, while the crew carried was 4. This could probably work at 3.0 as a relatively lightly armoured vehicle, with a decent gun and much better firing arcs than previous vehicles, giving German players a vehicle vaguely analogous to the better protected Sherman M4A3 105, and I think this would be a great vehicle to have in War Thunder. In real life, 2 prototypes would be built, followed by 10 pre-production vehicles which were built from August to December 1942. But ultimately it was found that mounting the 105mm howitzer on the Panzer II as the Vespa was a better solution than building a completely new vehicle, especially as the new chassis, while based on the Panzer IV, used many parts that were not interchangeable between the two vehicles, so development of the 4B was halted. Despite this, half of the constructed vehicles were assigned to the 16th Panzer Division, which would be destroyed at the Battle of Stalingrad, with all 6 vehicles lost, while the remaining 4 plus the 2 prototypes would remain in Germany as training vehicles, with only one remaining to be discovered by the Allies at the end of the war, minus its gun. Despite the failure of the Geschützwagen 4B, Krupp would develop a similar vehicle a few years later, the Heuschrecker 10, or Waffenträger GW4B, which was technically a Waffenträger or weapon carrier. Indeed, for a long time, this is the vehicle I thought of when I heard the term Waffenträger. Now, you might be wondering in what way this qualifies as a Waffenträger, and that is because the requirement that this vehicle was designed for called for the ability to remove the turret and gun from the vehicle and deploy it as a stationary artillery piece. And it could even be towed much like a conventional artillery piece if required. Now, how useful this would have been in practice is questionable, and I doubt this would be implemented in War Thunder, but it is definitely one of the more unique features of an armoured vehicle that I have seen. As for the main armament carried, this was the 105mm LEFH 18/1 length 28 howitzer, which, due to now being mounted in a fully rotating turret, has 360 degrees of fire and an elevation of 0 to +68, while firing the same shells as we have looked at earlier, namely HE, APC-BC, heat, Sabo and smoke shells, but no machine guns are carried. Unfortunately, armour is rather light, with some sources saying that it maxes out at 20mm for the front and 15mm for the sides, while others have it maxing out slightly thicker at 30mm for the front and 16mm for the sides and rear. But either way, this isn't particularly well armoured, and the turret sides and rear could also be folded down, which would remove the protection but would give more room for the gun crew, which could be an optional modification that makes the turret crew vulnerable but gives a faster fire rate, which would be a unique feature of this vehicle. Meanwhile, the chassis used is the Geschützwagen 3/4, and its top speed is 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour from a 285 horsepower Maybach HL120 TRM, though again at least one other source gives it as the 360 horsepower Maybach HL90, while the crew carried is 5. This would make for a good vehicle to add at a minimum of 3.0 on account of the large variety of shells available, and the fact it has a fully traversable turret unlike previous designs. And although I know it wouldn't be represented in game, the deployable turret would make this an extremely unique vehicle, and it would be nice to see it added in game in some fashion. In real life, at least one prototype was built, although some sources say 3 were built, and this underwent testing on the 13th of October 1943, which prompted some modifications, with firing trials commencing from January to 31st of May 1944. Ultimately, these trials resulted in the cancellation of the project, primarily due to the clumsiness in removing the turret and the additional complexity over existing vehicles. That said, the prototype was captured at the end of the war by American troops, and still exists to this day at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. However, there would be a competing design for this Waffenträger requirement, namely the 10.5cm LEFH 18/40/2 SF Alf Geschützwagen 3/4, which was designed by Alket. The main armament for this design was, as you could probably guess, the 105mm LEFH 18/40/2 length 28 howitzer, which was lighter than the previous LEFH 18 designs, and is again designed to be deployed from the vehicle. But unlike the Krupp design, only the gun is deployed, with the turret remaining on the chassis. As for the weapon itself, it is fitted in a fully rotating turret with an elevation of -10 to +70, which is better than the Krupp design, and this fires all of the previous 105mm shells we looked at. And it was for this weapon that the Panzergranate 39TS Sabo shell was developed, with the Sabo shell carrying an 88mm Panzergranate 39 shell, and was capable of penetrating 91mm at 500 metres, which is pretty good, and again a machine gun is not carried. Armour is still pretty light, maxing out at just 30mm for the front and 20mm for the sides, while the turret is open-topped, making it very vulnerable to aircraft. Meanwhile, the top speed is 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour from a 285 horsepower Maybach HL120 TRM engine, while the crew complement is 5. Again, this could be added at 3.0 or higher, maybe folded with the Heuschrecker 10, with this vehicle maybe having access to the Sabo shell to differentiate it from the Krupp design, and it would likely play in the same fashion as that vehicle, but I would still like to see it in War Thunder, albeit as a low priority. In real life, a single prototype was constructed and tested on the 28th of May 1944, where a number of issues arose, namely the 15 minutes it took to deploy the gun, and the cramped fighting compartment. So modifications were made and it was tested again on the 28th of May, and presumably did well as production was due to start in October 1944. However, this never occurred and all production was halted in December 1944, but surprisingly the prototype survived the war and still exists to this day in a private collection. So that is most of the self-propelled gun and howitzer vehicles based on the Panzer IV, but there are still a few variants of an existing vehicle that need adding as well, and I am of course talking about the Brummbär or Sturmpanzer IV. You see, the Brummbär technically comes in 4 production series, with modifications made in each series, with 52 of the 60 built for the first series being built on the Panzer IV-G chassis. However, the remaining 8 were built on the Panzer IV-E, which has the disadvantage of 20mm side and rear armour, while the lowermost frontal hull is 30mm, versus 30mm for the side armour and 80mm for the lower hull front of the G. Naturally, Gaijin decided to add the rather obscure E variant, giving us a Brummbär that frankly doesn't live up to its full potential with regards to protection. Now admittedly we are only talking about a 10mm difference for the side armour, and the lower frontal hull isn't a massive target, but it still seems very odd for this variant to be the one that's in game, especially for a premium vehicle, so I suggest that the Brummbär built on the Panzer IV-G should also be added in the tech tree. Then of course there is the subsequent series, with the second introducing a reinforced driver's hatch, the third a lighter main armament, and in the 4th series a ball-mounted machine gun was added on the top left of the front of the vehicle, given the ability to defend from soft-skin vehicles, while some of the previous series also had an MG34 mounted on the roof, and I think all of these variants could be introduced in a folder in the regular tech tree, even if not as a priority. So moving on from the Panzer IV, we now have the Panther, and frankly there isn't really any options here, with the closest being the Mittlerer Waffenträger SFH-18 Alf Panther Dunfandig, which we don't have any photos of for reasons that will become apparent. Now I'm not going to get too much into the details for this, but basically this was another Waffenträger design, where the gun was to be dismountable, and various designs were submitted by Krupp from July to October 1944, despite being ordered to halt working on the design, with the requirement itself cancelled in November 1944. However, on the 6th of February 1945, a telex message stated that the chassis was ready, though not the turret, but on the 20th of February 1945 the project was completely terminated anyway. Now it seems clear that this vehicle was never actually finished and probably never even had an engine installed, but it was to be armed with the SFH-18, firing the same ammunition as the Hummel, while the armour was to max out at 30mm and the top speed would presumably be 28.5 miles per hour or 46 kilometers an hour like on the late Panthers in-game, and probably 6 crew would be carried. Honestly, this probably shouldn't be added, except maybe in the same fashion as the E100 due to it never being anywhere close to finished, let alone tested, and it would have to be a very low priority vehicle for adding, but it felt remiss not to mention it at all. So moving on from the Panther, we now come to the Tiger tank, and again we only really have the one option in the form of the Griller 1721, or Geschützwagen Tiger, and straight away you can see a big difference over the Panther design, in that this one actually has pictures, which is a big plus, though again it suffers from the same problems as the Panther design. Again, without going into too much detail, this design came from a 1942 requirement for a vehicle that could carry various heavy weapons which could be dismounted, which does seem to be a recurring theme with these late war designs. A prototype was ordered in January 1943 and was to use a modified Tiger II chassis, but it was still unfinished on 7th of December 1944, when it was ready to move to the Haustenbeck Ordnance Proving and Tank Testing Ground in northern Germany. And in January 1945, all work was cancelled, and this was the state that the prototype was found when the US Army found it. Now, the weapons that were intended to be fitted were the 17cm K72 SF length 50, the 21cm LMRS 18/1 SF length 31, and the 30.5cm GRW length 16. But none of these appear to have been fitted, though a 17cm K72 was present near to the vehicle when it was found. So if any variant was going to be added, it seems logical this would be the one to add, with the K72 firing shells at 620 to 925 meters a second depending on the charge used, though again we will assume the largest possible is used, and it could fire 2 HE shells, weighing 62.8 to 71 kilograms, with these likely to one-shot most vehicles, while an APC-BC shell could also be fired, penetrating 255mm at 1000 meters at a 30-degree angle, which is again a pretty good performance. Meanwhile, the horizontal traverse was to be 5 degrees right and left, with the elevation being 0 to plus 50, while at least one machine gun was to be carried in the bow and possibly another on the roof. As you can see, this vehicle was massive, weighing in at 58 tons, being 13 meters long, including the K72 barrel, 3.27 meters wide and 3.15 meters high. But unfortunately, the armour is very thin, maxing out at just 30mm for the front and 16mm for the sides and rear, while the fighting compartment is open-topped, making it very vulnerable to aircraft. That said, its mobility isn't the worst, with its top speed being 21.7 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour to 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour depending on the source used, which isn't bad at all, with this powered by a 690 horsepower Maybach HL 230 P30 engine, while the crew carried was 7 to 8, again depending on the source. Like with the Waffenträger Panther, this probably shouldn't be added except as a very rare event vehicle, but would likely be a bit more of a priority just because we have photos of it, and if it was added, it would surely be a monster of an SPG to face on the battlefield. In real life, only the one prototype was constructed, and unfortunately, despite being extensively photographed, the prototype was most likely scrapped. So that is pretty much all of the German tank-based SPG and SPH vehicles, But we do have a few options that were based on non-tank vehicles, like the Raupenschlepper Ost or RSO, a vehicle we have previously looked at in the Tank Destroyer video, which also seems to have carried various artillery pieces as well, or was at least tested with carrying them. The first of these weapons is the 7.5cm Gebirgshaubitze 34, which could fire 2 HE shells, a smoke shell, and most importantly the GR38 heat shell, which can penetrate up to 115mm in game, at least with the C version, making this a pretty deadly weapon. The only downside I could see with this weapon is the elevation when firing forwards, but the windshield can be dropped, which should hopefully fix that problem. Another weapon used was the 105mm GEBH-40, a mountain gun that could fire shells up to 565 meters a second, with its maximum charge, and could fire HE and the GR39 HLC heat shell, which as mentioned can penetrate 115mm of armour. So again, this is pretty good. Lastly, the SIG-33 was mounted, with its effective HE and heat shell that penetrates 185mm in game. So that gives us a few good options with regards to armament. However, there is some debate on whether these could actually be fired from the vehicle, with evidence suggesting that the GEBH-36 could or was intended to be fired from the vehicle, but less evidence with the other two guns, which may have just been loaded to show that the vehicle could transport them, so their inclusion is a bit more up in the air. As for the Raupenschlepper Ost itself, it is completely unarmoured, has a top speed of 18 miles per hour or 30 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 3 to 4. I could see these being added in-game at the early tiers, with some in the regular tech tree and some perhaps as event vehicles, and it would give German players some more choices in artillery weapons, and more of a reason to add the RSO. Now that's mostly it for German vehicles, but I had intended to look at this massive vehicle, the Karl Garat, which was fitted with a 60cm and later 54cm mortar, capable of firing 1.25 to 2.17 ton shells. But while the gun does appear to be capable of pointing at 0 degrees, which would technically make it usable, it unfortunately could only be fired at plus 55 degrees at a minimum, making it unsuited for adding in any sort of role. However, while we have gone through all of the German vehicles, there were various captured British and French tanks that were also fitted with artillery weapons that could be added. The first of these is the 10.5cm LEFH-16 Aufgeschutzwagen Mark 6E, which was the British light tank Mark 6 fitted with the 105mm LEFH-16 howitzer from the World War I period. This came about after many British Mark 6 light tanks were abandoned by the British Expeditionary Force or BEF after the fall of France, with these tanks generally being obsolete for frontline service. However, a German officer, Alfred Becker, who commanded the 15th Artillery Regiment of the 227th Infantry Division and was also a pretty skilled mechanic, decided to convert these light tanks into SPGs, which was done by removing the upper superstructure and turret and placing the new 105mm gun to the vehicle with some welded plates for protection. The LEFH-16 howitzer itself was already obsolete at the start of the war. As mentioned, its design dated back to World War I. But it fires the same ammunition types as the later LEFH-18 with a maximum muzzle velocity of around 400 meters a second, and it had a horizontal traverse of just 4 degrees and an elevation of -10 to +40 degrees. Unfortunately, it is still very lightly protected, with the armour only maxing out at 22mm for the frontal superstructure and 13mm for the sides, and it is of course open-topped, while the top speed was 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour and the crew was 4. In-game this could work at around 2.3, having a decent gun and top speed, though of course very vulnerable to enemy attacks, but its small size should allow it to conceal itself relatively easily, and it would be nice for this early converted vehicle to be available in War Thunder. In real life it seems only 6 to 7 were built, though some sources claim up to 12 were made, and in October 1941 the 15th Artillery Regiment, including 6 of the Mark 6Es, were transferred to the Eastern Front, and seem to have performed very well, giving German forces a small but effective mobile artillery unit, with the vehicles themselves surviving into early 1942. However, they would seriously impress the right people and would give Becker's career a nice boost, as he would be recalled from the front line and placed in charge of a unit known as Baukommando Becker, or Construction Unit Becker, with the task of converting various unarmed or obsolete vehicles, usually French, into effective tank destroyer and mobile artillery vehicles, and these would go on to give useful service for Germany for relatively little cost, at least compared to building completely new vehicles. So moving on from converted British vehicles, we can now take a look at the converted French vehicles, starting with the Lorraine 37L, which was fitted with various armaments in German service. Starting with the vehicle itself, this was basically a tractor for carrying supplies, having a top speed of around 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour and a maximum of 12mm of armour. However, after the fall of France, most of the 480 Lorraine 37Ls fell into German hands, with many of these converted to carry the 75mm PaK 40 anti-tank gun, but a lesser number were fitted with artillery guns, including the 105mm LEFH 18, 15cm SFH 13, and in at least one case, a captured Soviet 122mm M30 howitzer. We have already looked at the LEFH 18 previously in the video, but the SFH 13 was an old weapon dating back to just before World War I, and was mostly assigned to reserve units, but these were still in service in World War II, with more captured from the Belgian and Dutch armies. This weapon was able to fire many of the same shells as the later SFH 18, including many of the HE, anti-concrete, heat and smoke shells, making this effective against a variety of targets. Luckily for us, the 122mm SFH 396R, aka the Soviet M30, is already in game on the Su-122, being able to fire a HE shell with 37mm penetration, a heat shell with 160mm penetration, and a smoke shell, again making this a rather deadly weapon as well. Meanwhile, the elevation for the guns should be about 5 degrees left and right, with an elevation of 0 to plus 40 degrees, and a crew of 4 would be carried. The vehicles armed with the 105mm and 15cm guns would be good regular vehicles to add somewhere between 2.3 to 3.0, having a good variety of ammunition, but let down by their thin armour, slow speed and small crew. Meanwhile, the 122mm variant could be an event vehicle at 2.3, seeing as this was a rarer variant. In real life, 12 105mm vehicles would be created, along with 94 15cm vehicles, with these serving in North Africa and Western Europe, and these were mostly destroyed, though a few do survive, while just one was fitted with the 122mm howitzer, and the vehicle was then mounted on an armoured train, but could be disembarked for combat, and this was destroyed in 1946 after being used in the French film La Bataille des Rails, or the Battle of the Rails, where the train it is on is derailed and it was presumably scrapped after the derailment. So the Germans had found a good use for these French tractors, but of course it also had a lot of French tanks that were frankly hopelessly obsolete on the modern battlefield, but would still make good platforms for various artillery weapons, giving them a new lease of life. One of these tanks was the Hotchkiss H39 or Geschützwagen 39HF, which, as we looked at in the previous episode, was also used as a tank destroyer, with the modification carried out on the same lines as on the Lorraine 37L, now being fitted with a 105mm LEFH 18 with a horizontal traverse of 30 degrees each way and an elevation of -5 to +22, while a 7.92mm MG34 is also carried. Some were also armed with the older LEFH 16, and these could also be added if necessary. However, unlike the 37L, it is a bit more armoured, with the superstructure coming in at 20mm for the front and sides, while the whole maxes out at 40mm for the same flanks, giving this a slightly better fighting chance against less penetrating weapons, though of course it is still open-topped. Meanwhile, the top speed is 22 miles per hour or 36 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 4 is carried. This could be added at 2.3, having a decent gun and better armour, but not the best speed, but still making for an OK SPG. In real life, 48 Hotchkiss H39s would be converted, carry the 105mm howitzer, and these would serve in France during the Normandy invasion, with these being lost in the fighting, with only one surviving today in the Musée de Blondet in France. There would also be a similar conversion done to the FCM-36 or Geschützwagen FCM-36F, which again is similar to the tank destroyer version that we looked at before, and is definitely an interesting looking design. And as mentioned last time, the FCM-36 was rather different from other French tanks, in that it has a diesel engine and welded armour, and only 100 were built. This again has a maximum of about 15 to 20mm of armour for the superstructure and 40mm for the hull, and is again open-topped, while a 105mm LEFH-16 was carried, while the top speed is unfortunately now just 15 miles per hour or 24 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 4 is again carried. In real life, only 12 FCM-36s were converted to this standard, in large part due to how few FCM-36s would have survived the Battle of France intact, as well as its use of a diesel engine. And while they were around in France from the autumn of 1942, they seem to have disappeared by early 1944, perhaps due to mechanical issues, and it's unknown if they served in combat during the Normandy invasion. So that's almost all of the French tanks, but there is one last design for us to look at, the Geschützwagen B2F, which was based on the Char B1 Bis heavy tank. Now here the hull is rather reminiscent of World War I tank designs, with the tracks going around the entirety of the hull, and there is very little change to the hull besides removing the hull-mounted 75mm howitzer and armouring over the resulting gap. However, a larger change has taken place atop the tank where the turret used to be, with this now replaced by a 105mm LEFH-18 howitzer, with a limited traverse of 15 degrees horizontally and an elevation of -4 to +20. This also makes the tank significantly taller, now coming in at 3.05 metres tall versus 2.88 metres tall for the regular Char B1 Bis, making this a much more prominent target. Worse still, while the rest of the tank is very heavily armoured at 60mm for the front, and the new superstructure is only 20mm all round and is open-topped, meaning any enemy could simply target the rather prominent gun position and easily wipe out most or all of the crew. Meanwhile, the 32.5-ton tank only has a top speed of 17 miles per hour or 28 kilometers an hour, which is not the best, while the crew is numbered at 4 to 5 depending on the source used. In-game this could probably work at 2.3, having a greatly protected hull and good armament, but let down by its speed and the ease with which it can be destroyed if the fighting compartment is targeted. But I could see this unusual looking vehicle gaining some popularity in-game. In real life, only 16 of these B2s were produced in 1942 by Rheinmetall Borsig, with these remaining in France, and they were intended to support the Char B1 Bis tanks that had been converted to carry flamethrowers. But as it turns out, the flamethrower tanks were ready in 1941 while the howitzer vehicles weren't, and so they went into action without them, meaning that the SPG vehicles seem to have not actually seen any combat. Honestly, while most of the SPG conversions the Germans made all make sense to various degrees, the Char B1 Bis seems to suit this role the least out of all the tanks we've looked at, as you have a tank that, while not great, does have a unique selling point of very heavy armour for the time, making it well suited for attacking strong points, either with its existing armaments or flamethrowers or some alternate armament, yet instead has been fitted with an artillery gun that is intended to be used far behind the front line, where that armour doesn't really make any difference. And honestly, if the Germans had fitted a bigger gun, it probably would have made more sense at least, so this feels like a missed opportunity for the vehicle in real life, though it's also possible it was just done for logistics reasons, as after all it was supposed to help the flamethrower variant that the Germans created out of the Char B1 Bis. So that's it for this episode looking at German SPG, artillery and assault vehicles, and I'd like to hear your views on these vehicles and any other vehicles you'd like me to cover in the comments below. Now, I'm not entirely sure what we'll be covering next. I may cover a smaller nation like Argentina or Australia or Canada, or we may go on to German armoured cars, or maybe we'll look at one of the other major nations that I haven't looked at in quite a long time. But we'll just have to see how things turn out. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.